Welcome to Purbright Files, solving secrets behind every crime.
The village of St. Aldhelms was the kind of place where time seemed to move more slowly, its days governed by the rhythm of church bells, garden routines, and the comforting chatter of neighbors who all knew one another's business. Cottages leaned companionably toward one another along cobbled lanes, their windows brimming with geraniums, and in the center of it all stood the ancient Clocktower. Its stone walls had watched over centuries of weddings, funerals, and fêtes. Children took its chimes for granted, though older folk liked to say that the tower held secrets, its heavy bell sounding not just the hour, but the pulse of the village itself. On a brilliant June afternoon, the Clocktower's presence was festive rather than foreboding. The summer fête, long anticipated, was in full swing. Striped tents circled the village green, stalls laden with sponge cakes, jars of jam, and knitted socks. There was laughter as children darted beneath the bunting, their fingers sticky from toffee apples, while the brass band tested its notes on the far side of the field, the music carrying cheerfully on the breeze. It was a day that seemed, to most, entirely ordinary. Miss Marple, sitting at the edge of the crowd with her knitting bag neatly on her lap, looked to be no more than a pleasant elderly lady observing the gaiety. Her eyes, however, missed very little. She noted how Mrs. Carter, whose sponge cakes had won the competition 3 years in a row, cast sharp glances at the new entrance Victoria Sponge, how young Alice Brent, rebellious in her short skirt, rolled her eyes at her mother's scolding, how George Taverner, the local magistrate, laughed rather too loudly at his own joke, his eyes not quite meeting those of the vicar's wife. To most, these were trifles. To Miss Marple, they were glimpses into the endlessly fascinating theatre of human nature. "Mark my words," said Mrs. Weatherby, the vicar's wife, lowering herself onto the bench beside her. "This fête may look charming, but there will be some upset before it is over. There always is. Why, last year Mrs. Knight declared Mrs. Barnes's strawberry jam was shop-bought, and nearly caused a scandal." Miss Marple gave a polite smile, her needles clicking softly. "Human nature is very much the same everywhere, dear. Pride, envy, ambition, they appear in the village fête just as in Parliament." Before Mrs. Weatherby could reply, the Clocktower bell tolled 3. Its deep, resonant notes silenced the band's fumbling scales and called all eyes toward the temporary stage. Reverend Weatherby, tall and rather solemn, stepped forward to make his customary opening remarks. He spoke of community, of tradition, of the blessings of fine weather. The villagers clapped politely. The fête was declared open. It was then that an odd sound cut across the applause. At first it was scarcely noticed, a muffled cry drifting from the direction of the Clocktower. A few children giggled, thinking it part of the entertainment. But the sound came again, sharper, more urgent, and then stopped abruptly, as though smothered. Heads turned. A murmur spread through the crowd. The narrow wooden door at the base of the tower stood slightly ajar. A group of villagers moved toward it, half curious, half concerned. The magistrate, George Taverner, puffed up with importance, was the first to reach the threshold. He pushed the door open wider, peered inside, and then recoiled. A woman screamed. The cry rippled outward, silencing laughter, freezing motion. Mothers clutched children closer. Men hurried forward, their expressions grave. Miss Marple rose quietly, her knitting still in her hand, and followed the trickle of people toward the tower. Inside, the cool air smelled faintly of stone dust and oil from the bell mechanism above. On the winding stone steps lay Harold Pritchard, the church caretaker. His body was twisted grotesquely, his neck bent at an unnatural angle, his spectacles shattered on the floor beside him. One hand lay outstretched, curled around a small metallic object glinting faintly in the dim light. His face, pale and slack, bore an expression of startled pain. For a moment silence reigned, broken only by the flutter of a pigeon startled from the rafters. Then voices erupted. "Good heavens, poor Pritchard! You must have fallen, slipped on the steps. What a dreadful thing at the fête of all days." George Taverner lifted his chin, eager to impose authority. "An accident," he declared loudly, though his own voice trembled slightly. "The man must have lost his footing. These old stairs are treacherous. Best not to crowd in, ladies. But not everyone was satisfied. Mrs. Carter pressed a hand to her bosom, wide-eyed. But Harold knew those stairs better than anyone. He went up every day to wind the clock. Inspector Graves, summoned quickly from his booth at the Green, shouldered through the crowd. A stocky man with a bristling mustache, he bent over the body with the air of one accustomed to sudden tragedies. Neck's broken right enough. Looks like a fall to me. Best clear the area. Let's not have hysteria. As the villagers dispersed reluctantly, whispering furiously, Miss Marple lingered near the doorway, her sharp blue eyes scanning the scene. She noted the scuff marks on the stone steps a few feet above the body, as though there had been a brief struggle. She noticed too the absence of dust along the banister, as if a hand had gripped it roughly very recently. And most of all, she noticed the metallic object in Harold's clenched hand, partially hidden but unmistakably deliberate, not the sort of thing one clutched in a mere accident. She said nothing. Instead, she folded her knitting carefully into her bag and allowed Mrs. Weatherby to take her arm, murmuring reassurance. But her mind was already ticking faster than the clock above. In her long life, she had seen enough sudden deaths to know the difference between mischance and malice, and though she would never have spoken so bluntly to the gathering crowd, she had a very firm conviction that Harold Pritchard had not merely fallen. By the time the fete stalls were being hastily closed and the children herded home, the shadow of the clock tower stretched long across the Green, darker than it had ever seemed before. The bell above had ceased chiming, silenced by the death of the man who tended it, and in that silence there was an unease that the villagers would carry with them. They would tell themselves it was an accident, a sad but ordinary thing, and Inspector Graves would likely agree. Yet Miss Marple, her expression mild and composed, knew better. There was something hidden here, something that lay just beneath the polished surface of village life, and as always, it would be revealed in time. The morning after the fete dawned bright and deceptively peaceful, as though the village itself were determined to shrug off the events of the previous day. Yet beneath the stillness, the news of Harold Pritchard's death was already the only subject of conversation. It spread along the lanes faster than the vicar's sermons ever had, finding its way into kitchens, over garden fences, and into the ears of anyone willing to listen. At the grocer's shop, Mrs. Carter, tall and rather formidable with her sharp eyes and sharper tongue, was already holding court. It was an accident, they say. Nonsense. Harold was steady as an ox. Those steps, he'd climbed them every week for 30 years. If you ask me, there's more to it than meets the eye. You don't suppose he was pushed, whispered Mrs. Knight, clutching her basket a little too tightly. She glanced about, as though the killer might be lurking behind the sugar bins. Mrs. Carter sniffed. Pushed, tripped, threatened. I wouldn't be surprised. The man knew everyone's secrets. A caretaker sees more than people imagine. A murmur of agreement followed. That was always the way in St. Aldhelms. Once the suggestion of scandal was aired, it grew quickly, fed by speculation and suspicion. In the post office, George Taverner was equally firm in his views. A fool, he insisted to a small cluster of listeners, puffing out his chest as though his authority might settle the matter. Purely accidental. Graves told me himself. The body shows nothing to suggest foul play. We mustn't let idle chatter ruin the village's good name. But even as he spoke, his listeners exchanged glances. Taverner had been seen arguing with Pritchard not a fortnight ago about repairs to the tower clock. Some remembered raised voices. Others claimed Pritchard had threatened to report the magistrate's negligence to the diocesan council. Such quarrels, once whispered about, took on darker shapes in the light of tragedy. By mid-morning, Miss Marple, taking her customary walk through the village with her basket for the market, had gathered more information from chance remarks than most would in a week. She did not ask questions. She never needed to. People volunteered their theories with the eagerness of children showing off schoolwork, and they never realized how much they revealed in the process. "Terrible business, Miss Marple," said Mr. Harding, the retired schoolmaster, as he paused by his gate. "I always said Pritchard was too officious, always poking his nose where it wasn't wanted. I shouldn't be surprised if someone had finally had enough of it." He nodded sagely, as though that closed the matter. "Do you really think so?" Miss Marple asked, her tone one of mild interest rather than challenge. "Well, people will do rash things when provoked," he replied, lowering his voice. "I dare say you've noticed young Peter Morton skulking about. Hot-tempered lad. He and Pritchard had words over bell-ringing practice. I heard it myself. It wouldn't take much to push a boy like that into something regrettable." Miss Marple thanked him politely and went on her way, her mind turning over the words. Young Morton had indeed a reputation for temper, but temper was not the same as violence. She recalled how, during the fete, Peter had been seen with Alice Brent, laughing rather sheepishly in her company. It was not the manner of a young man fresh from a crime of passion. Later, in the tea shop, Miss Marple heard a different tale. Mrs. Barnes, pouring tea with unnecessary flourish, declared to her table of friends that Pritchard had been hinting at discovering something dreadful about one of the villagers. "Mark my words," she said, wagging a finger. "He knew too much, and now he's dead. Doesn't that tell you everything?" Her friends gasped, leaned closer, and began to speculate furiously about who had most to lose from Pritchard's knowledge. One suggested the vicar's wife, another hinted darkly about George Taverner's finances, and a third muttered that Mrs. Carter's son had been seen sneaking out of the tower late at night. Each rumour, Miss Marple observed, said as much about the speaker's prejudices as it did about Harold Pritchard. By evening, the village had divided itself neatly into camps. Some were content with Inspector Graves's pronouncement of accident, others whispered of murder, each with their own favoured suspect. The common thread was that everyone seemed to believe they knew the truth, though no two versions matched. Miss Marple, sitting by her window with her knitting, allowed the fragments to settle in her mind. She recalled the clenched hand around the metallic object, the scuff marks on the stair, the strangely wiped banister. Accidents seldom left such marks of intent. She had also seen quite clearly the way George Taverner had paled at the sight of the body, and the nervous twitch of Mrs. Carter when the inspector asked where she had been at the time of the cry. Little things, small as the dropped stitches in her knitting, but together they began to form a pattern. It was not yet a clear picture, nor did she expect it to be. Human nature seldom revealed itself all at once. It came out in dribbles and contradictions, in slips of the tongue and looks exchanged. The villagers were only beginning to speak. Soon enough, more would surface. She sighed softly, setting aside her knitting. The tragedy had upset the delicate balance of St. Aldhelm's, and in the days ahead that imbalance would show itself in sharper relief. Quarrels would be remembered, secrets hinted at, and the comfortable certainty of village life would fracture. In that breaking, truth would emerge. For now, Miss Marple only thought of poor Harold Pritchard, lying alone in the church hall until arrangements could be made. She wondered what he had meant to signal with that metallic object clutched in his hand. It was not the gesture of a man slipping into death unawares. No, Harold had been trying to leave a message, and when the time was right she would understand it. The Clocktower bell, silenced since the accident, did not chime that evening. Its absence was felt keenly across the village. For the first time in living memory, St. Aldhelm's night was without its measure of hours, as though time itself were holding its breath. The villagers closed their shutters, whispered their theories to one another, and went to bed with unease in their hearts. Only Miss Marple, alone in her quiet sitting room, remained calmly attentive, waiting for human nature to reveal its inevitable truth. Inspector Graves returned to the village the following morning with a determination that was plain for all to see. A man of solid build, with a bristling mustache that seemed to bridle at contradiction. He was not one to tolerate loose speculation when an official conclusion could be reached. To his mind, Harold Pritchard's death was a regrettable accident, and the sooner that fact was firmly established, the sooner order could be restored. Yet, in villages such as St. Aldhelm's, order was a fragile thing. People clung to rumor as though it were a lifeline, and already the whispers of murder had taken root. Graves began with the practicalities. The body had been examined again that morning, and the conclusion remained unchanged. Broken neck, no obvious external wounds, save for some minor bruising consistent with a fall. A clean case, he told the vicar in clipped tones. The man slipped, broke his neck, and that's the end of it. Reverend Weatherby nodded solemnly, though he looked unconvinced. Still, Inspector, one cannot deny that the villagers are unsettled. They will not be satisfied with a simple explanation. That, Graves replied curtly, is their problem, not mine. But as he strode across the green toward the tower once more, he could not ignore the cluster of onlookers who lingered at a discreet distance, watching with the hungry curiosity of people who sense drama. Among them was Mrs. Carter, her lips tight with judgment, Mrs. Knight, pretending to shop for vegetables but clearly straining to hear, and young Alice Brent, who leaned against the fence with a defiant air, as though daring anyone to question her presence. Miss Marple was there too, knitting in hand, her quiet eyes following every movement. Inside the tower, Graves examined the steps again. The scuff marks were noted but dismissed. Anyone could have left those, he muttered. Children playing about, or Pritchard himself in his fall. Nothing to be made of it. He ran a hand along the banister, which still bore an odd patch free of dust. That too he dismissed. He must have gripped here as he fell. Natural enough. The metallic object in Pritchard's hand, however, could not be so easily set aside. It had been pried from his stiffened fingers and set upon the inspector's desk. A key, small and of unusual design, its head worked into a curious shape like an old crest or symbol. Graves turned it over now with impatience. It clearly opened something, but what? No villager had yet come forward to identify it, and the caretaker's own cottage contained no lock that it fit. When word spread that Pritchard had died clutching a mysterious key, the village's appetite for scandal doubled. Some whispered of hidden treasure in the church, others of a secret will, still others of Pritchard blackmailing half the parish. Every theory found its audience, and every audience found a likely culprit. It was not long before a name surfaced more frequently than others. Peter Morton. Young, quick-tempered, with a reputation for defiance, he had quarreled openly with Pritchard only weeks earlier. The caretaker had chastised him for missing bell-ringing practice, and Peter had answered with sullen resentment. Several villagers claimed they had heard raised voices, and at least one insisted Peter had threatened. "You'll be sorry one day." Such words, vague in the heat of youth, took on a sinister weight in hindsight. Graves seized upon the theory with relief. It was tidy, plausible, and best of all, it offered him a suspect to present as a cautionary tale. The lad was called in for questioning, and half the village watched him walk toward the inspector's office with the sort of grim fascination usually reserved for public executions. Peter came reluctantly, his face pale but his eyes bright with defiance. He admitted freely to the quarrel, but denied with equal force any part in Pritchard's death. "I was with Alice Brent at the fete," he declared, glaring at Graves as though daring him to contradict. "Half the green must have seen us. We heard the cry same as everyone else." Alice herself confirmed it, though her testimony was colored with the melodrama of youth. "Peter wouldn't hurt anyone," she insisted. "Harold was horrid to him, always on about duty and punctuality. But Peter isn't a killer. It's absurd to think so." Graves, however, was not inclined to be swayed by girlish loyalty. He pressed Peter with questions, suggested that youthful temper might flare into violence, hinted that the key might be linked to some mischief Peter had been caught up in. The boy only grew more indignant, until at last Graves released him with a warning. "Mind yourself, lad. You'll be watched closely." Outside, the village was quick to judge. "Guilty as sin," muttered Mr. Harding, the schoolmaster, to anyone who would listen. "Hot-headed boy, always was. If you ask me, Graves should have locked him up." Others were less certain. Mrs. Barnes whispered that she'd seen George Taverner himself slip away from the fete shortly before the cry was heard. Mrs. Knight hinted that Mrs. Carter had been unusually flustered when the body was discovered. The tide of gossip swirled, catching every name in turn, but it returned most often to Peter Morton, for youth and anger were easy things to blame. Through it all, Miss Marple listened. She had sat quietly on the bench by the green, as Peter was questioned, her needles flashing in the sunlight. She had watched the boy's defiance, the magistrate's discomfort, the inspector's eagerness to settle the matter quickly. Most importantly, She had seen the fleeting look of alarm on Mrs. Carter's face when the key was mentioned, a look so quickly masked that only the most attentive eye could have noticed. Later that afternoon, she paid a visit to Mrs. Weatherby, ostensibly to deliver a jar of quince jelly. They spoke politely of the fete, of the dreadful accident, of the sorrow of losing poor Harold. But when Miss Marple remarked casually, "I wonder what that key was meant to open," Miss Weatherby's expression tightened, and she glanced nervously toward the clock tower, as though half afraid it might hold the answer. Miss Marple said no more. She did not need to. Every reaction was a stitch in the tapestry she was quietly weaving. Graves might be satisfied with his hot-headed suspect, but she knew better. Human nature, in its sly evasions and guilty glances, spoke more truth than any official report. That night, the bell was still silent. The tower loomed dark against the sky, its presence unsettling now rather than comforting. In cottages across the village, people locked their doors a little earlier than usual and lay awake replaying every quarrel, every whispered secret, wondering which of their neighbors might be hiding more than they admitted. And in her own sitting room, Miss Marple set aside her knitting with a thoughtful sigh. She had no doubt that Harold Pritchard had been silenced, and that the key he clutched would unlock far more than any cupboard or chest. The village thought the mystery nearly solved. Miss Marple knew it had only just begun. The following day found the village in a peculiar state of anticipation, as though everyone expected Inspector Graves to stride onto the green with handcuffs and lead young Peter Morton away in disgrace. The boy's name had become the centerpiece of every whispered conversation, his youthful quarrels transformed into a litany of evidence by those eager to see the matter closed. Children repeated snippets overheard from their parents, women exchanged rumors at the butcher's counter, and even the men at the inn shook their heads with knowing gravity. "Hot-headed lad," said Mr. Barnes, polishing his pint glass behind the bar. "Always thought himself cleverer than his betters. I dare say he pushed Harold in a temper and never thought what would come of it." "And what about the key?" someone asked. Barnes shrugged. "Could be anything. But once the police get him to talk, he'll break. They always do." The villagers nodded. It was comforting, in a way, to have a culprit. It meant the world remained orderly, that danger had a face and could be removed. Few paused to consider whether the picture was too convenient. Inspector Graves certainly did not. By mid-morning he had summoned Peter again, this time with Alice Brent in tow. The two young people stood awkwardly in the parish office, facing Graves's stern gaze and the fidgeting presence of George Taverner, who had offered himself as a witness to the proceedings. "You admit," Graves said heavily, "that you quarreled with Pritchard. You admit you threatened him." "I never threatened him," Peter retorted hotly. "I only said he was unfair. Everyone knows how he went on about rules. It wasn't a threat." Graves leaned forward, mustache bristling. "And yet, the man is dead. Convenient for you, isn't it?" Peter's face flushed crimson. Alice, standing beside him, squeezed his arm as though to remind him to keep calm. "We were together," she said firmly. "We heard the cry from the green. Dozens of people must have seen us." "How could he have done it?" Graves grunted. "People are not always where they claim to be, and a clever lad could slip away unnoticed if he wished." George Taverner cleared his throat pompously. "If I may, Inspector, the boy has always been insolent. I've had reason to discipline him myself in the past. It's entirely within his character to lash out when provoked." Peter rounded on him. "You're lying. You hated Harold because he told the council about the clock repairs. Everyone knows you did." Taverner stiffened. "Impudent nonsense," he snapped, though his eyes darted away. Graves quickly silenced Peter with a barked order, and the questioning continued. Outside, word spread that Peter had been interrogated again, and by the afternoon, many villagers were convinced his arrest was imminent. Mrs. Knight declared she would not be surprised if the boy had been drinking. Mrs. Carter insisted she had always said he was a bad influence, and even Reverend Weatherby, though kindly in his tone, admitted that youthful folly sometimes leads to tragedy. But Miss Marple, who had been present in the background of the office as a supposed onlooker of no importance, was not satisfied. She had watched the exchanges carefully. Peter's fiery indignation, Alice's anxious loyalty, Taverner's involuntary glance away at the mention of the council. Most telling of all was Inspector Graves's eagerness to interpret every fact as supporting his theory. She had seen it before, men in authority preferring a neat solution to a complicated truth. Later that day, she paid a call on Mrs. Carter under the pretense of admiring her garden roses. The woman was flustered, her hands restless as she trimmed at petals that needed no trimming. "It's dreadful, Miss Marple, dreadful," she said. "But I suppose it had to happen sooner or later. Peter Morton was bound to come to a bad end. You know how young men are, so headstrong." Miss Marple bent to smell a bloom, her voice mild. "Yes, indeed. But I wonder, dear, did you notice poor Harold's hand? Such a curious thing for him to die clutching a key." Mrs. Carter's shears snipped too sharply, severing a healthy stem. She laughed a little too loudly. "A key? Oh, some trinket he carried about, no doubt. These old men hoard the oddest things. I wouldn't read too much into it." Miss Marple only smiled. She had no need to argue. People betrayed themselves far more in their efforts to appear unconcerned than in open statements. As the sun sank, the clock tower loomed over the green, its silent bell a constant reminder of the death. Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting needles moving with practiced rhythm, and considered the day's events. Peter was guilty in the eyes of many, but her own instincts told her otherwise. His defiance was the anger of youth, not the fear of a murderer. If he were guilty, he would have taken greater care to mask his resentment. Instead, he flared openly, unguarded, reckless. No, the truth lay elsewhere. In Taverner's nervous glance, in Mrs. Carter's forced laughter, in the vicar's wife's nervousness when the key was mentioned. Harold Pritchard had been a man who observed too much, perhaps who knew too much, and someone, fearing what he might reveal, had made certain he would never speak again. The village might prefer to see the culprit in a reckless boy, but Miss Marple had learned long ago that wickedness wore many disguises, and often the most respectable faces hid the darkest deeds. As she finished her row of stitches, she looked toward the shadow of the clock tower stretching across the fields, and thought quietly to herself that the true danger had yet to be recognized. The inquest was scheduled for the following morning, and the village gathered with a mixture of dread and anticipation. It was not every day that Merrymead, or any English village for that matter, held such grim proceedings, and the thought of hearing sworn testimony carried the allure of a theatre performance. Mrs. Knight dusted off her best hat. Mrs. Carter appeared with an air of solemn dignity, and even George Taverner wore a suit brushed free of its usual chalky streaks. Miss Marple slipped in quietly, her knitting bag hanging loosely at her arm, her eyes as bright as ever behind their gentleness. Inspector Graves took the stand first, detailing how Harold Pritchard had been discovered at the base of the clock tower, with bruises suggesting a violent struggle. He gave special emphasis to Peter Morton's quarrel earlier that day, to the boy's temper, and to the convenient opportunity. But when he came to the matter of the object clutched in Harold's hand, his words became less assured. "A key, yes," he admitted, producing the small, tarnished item in a handkerchief for all to see. "Of unusual make, though not of any door we have yet identified. Perhaps symbolic, perhaps incidental." The villagers murmured among themselves, but Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. She had examined enough locks in her time to know that this was no ordinary household key. Its length was too long, its notches oddly cut, and the head bore a faint engraving almost rubbed smooth but still discernible. A pattern, perhaps, or initial. When Alice Brent was called, she testified with quiet determination that she had been with Peter during the time of the crime. Her voice trembled slightly under the weight of so many eyes, but she did not falter. Peter himself was not called, a fact that seemed both a mercy and a condemnation. Inspector Graves preferred his neat picture unchallenged. Then came Mrs. Carter. She answered the coroner's questions dutifully, describing how she had seen Harold near the clock tower earlier in the evening. Yet, when pressed about his habits, her composure wavered. "He was a fussy man, very particular," she said quickly. "Always keeping lists, always writing things down. That key must have been another of his eccentricities." Miss Marple noted the nervous flicker of her eyes as she spoke, the way her hand gripped her purse strings too tightly. It was not fear of Harold, but fear of what Harold might have uncovered. After the inquest ended and the coroner announced an open verdict, murder by person or persons unknown, the crowd spilled out into the sunlight, buzzing with theories. Some declared Peter's guilt all but proven, others hinted at secret enemies, and a few, like Reverend Weatherby, muttered about the dangers of pride and secrecy. Miss Marple, however, walked home by a quieter lane, her thoughts dwelling on the key. She could not forget its shape. She remembered something from years ago, a case in a neighboring parish involving a churchwarden who had concealed valuable papers in a hidden compartment of the vestry. The lock had required a long key, oddly cut, not unlike the one Harold had held. Could it be that Harold had uncovered something hidden within the clock tower itself? That evening she sought out Mr. Marchmont, the elderly sexton who had tended the churchyard for decades. She found him oiling the hinges of the church gate, his stooped frame swaying gently with the motion. "Such dreadful business, Miss Marple," he sighed when she asked about the clock tower. "Why, I've known that tower since boyhood. My father tended it before me. There are places in it most folk have forgotten, old chambers, staircases bricked up, little cupboards built into the stone. The masons of long ago had their reasons. Some say valuables were hidden there during the wars." Miss Marple listened intently, her voice mild as she asked, "And would there be locks, Mr. Marchmont? Strange old locks, perhaps?" The sexton scratched his chin. "Aye, that there would. I've seen one myself, a queer old iron plate near the bell chamber. Never knew what it opened. Perhaps nothing, but it would take a key longer than most." Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her knitting hands itched for confirmation. Harold had died holding a key to some secret place in the clock tower, and if he had discovered it, then someone else had feared discovery enough to silence him. The thought troubled her. Harold Pritchard had not been a popular man, but he had been doggedly observant. He had noticed things others overlooked. Perhaps he had noticed too much. That night, as the village settled into uneasy sleep, Miss Marple sat by her lamplight, the key's image fixed in her mind. She thought of Mrs. Carter's nervous dismissal, of George Taverner's pompous hostility, of Reverend Weatherby's evasive glances. Any one of them could have had reason to fear exposure. The question was, what secret lay hidden in the shadows of the clock tower, and which respectable villager had killed to keep it buried? The key was no symbol, no trinket. It was the heart of the matter, the link between Harold's death and the silent stone giant that loomed over St. Mary Mead. And Miss Marple, with her unassuming ways, intended to see it opened, whatever truth lay within. The morning after the inquest, the village resumed its outward calm, though the air was thick with unspoken tension. People went about their errands with an eagerness that belied their unease. Miss Knight could be seen bustling between shops with her basket, exchanging knowing glances and whispers at every turn. At the post office, Mr. Barnes leaned across the counter to confide his theory that Harold had uncovered smuggling in the parish. By afternoon, half the village was repeating it as fact. Miss Marple, however, moved through these conversations with the same gentle nods and soft exclamations that always put people at ease. Few realized that while they talked, she was filing away every detail, the defensiveness in a voice, the inconsistency in a phrase, the sudden color in a cheek. It was in Mrs. Carter's drawing room that she lingered that afternoon, ostensibly for tea. Mrs. Carter was gracious as always, but her hand trembled slightly as she poured, spilling a thin trickle onto the saucer. "So dreadful about Harold," she said in tones of weary resignation. "One can only hope the police conclude matters quickly. Lingering suspicion is bad for the parish, don't you think?" Miss Marple sipped politely. "Indeed, dear. And yet one wonders, was it really so sudden? I had the impression Harold was a man who noticed things, perhaps even things he was not meant to." Mrs. Carter's eyes flicked up sharply before she forced a smile. "You mean his lists? Oh, he was forever scribbling. I dare say he made a note of every bird that landed on the green. Nothing dangerous in that." But Miss Marple, remembering the faint engraving on the key, suspected otherwise. Later, on her way home, she stopped to admire the churchyard, where Reverend Weatherby stood in quiet conversation with George Taverner. Their tones carried further than they intended, the vicar's voice low and urgent, Taverner's more forceful. "I tell you it must be dealt with," Taverner said. "If people learn—" "Lower your voice," Weatherby interrupted sharply. Then, catching sight of Miss Marple approaching, both men fell silent. The vicar greeted her with his usual mild courtesy, but there was a tightness about his mouth, a shadow in his eyes. "Oh, Miss Marple," he said, "we were just discussing arrangements for the harvest fair. I do hope the tragedy does not overshadow it." She inclined her head sweetly. "How thoughtful of you, Reverend." "Yes, life must go on, though one cannot help but think Harold's passing has left loose ends." Taverner muttered something about idle gossip and took his leave, striding off with more haste than dignity. That evening, Miss Marple considered her notes. There were too many loose threads for Graves's simple story of Peter Morton's temper. Taverner, clearly agitated about something hidden. Mrs. Carter, uneasy about Harold's habit of observation. Reverend Weatherby, masking a strain that showed in his every word. And the key, always the key, pointing back to the Clocktower. Her chance to examine that tower came sooner than expected. Mr. Marchmont, the sexton, stopped her at the church gate the next morning. "Strange thing, Miss Marple," he said, lowering his voice. "I had occasion to dust near the bell chamber yesterday, and I found scuff marks by the old iron plate. Fresh ones, mind you, as though someone had been tampering." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "How curious, Mr. Marchmont. Did you mention it to anyone?" He shook his head. "Didn't seem worth troubling Graves. He's got his mind set on the boy, hasn't he?" She thanked him warmly, though inside her thoughts quickened. Someone had indeed been at that old lock, and Harold had died holding a key that might fit it. Had Harold stumbled upon the attempt, catching the culprit in the act, or had he himself found the secret, only to be silenced before he could reveal it? That night, sleep came slowly. Miss Marple sat by her lamp, the tower looming in her mind's eye. What did the hidden chamber conceal? Something from long ago, no doubt, but still dangerous enough for someone respectable in the parish to kill over. She recalled an old case she had once heard about, where a curate had hidden letters proving another man's disgrace. Such things could fester for years, until at last they surfaced to destroy reputations. Perhaps Harold, with his nosy lists and careful eyes, had uncovered such a relic, something belonging to Mrs. Carter, or Taverner, or even the vicar. Her knitting needles clicked softly as she thought. People killed for many reasons: for money, for revenge, for love, for fear of shame. In St. Mary Mead, it was rarely the first and often the last. Respectability was a fragile mask, and when it cracked, the results could be fatal. As the clock struck midnight, Miss Marple set her knitting aside and gazed toward the dark outline of the tower. The truth was there, hidden in stone and shadow. Harold Pritchard had found it, and it had cost him his life. But Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, meant to uncover it fully, and she knew the murderer's composure would not last forever once the past began to stir. A week had passed since Harold Pritchard's death, and though the villagers of St. Aldhelms tried to maintain appearances, unease lingered like a shadow across every street and lane. The gossip, once a trickle of idle speculation, had become a torrent washing over the parish with accusations, half-truths, and fearful exaggerations. Peter Morton, though officially cleared of wrongdoing, found no solace in the attention. Children jeered as he passed, neighbors whispered behind his back, and even some of the adults' polite smiles carried the weight of suspicion. Miss Marple, however, moved among them with her usual gentle demeanor, taking in every glance, every hesitant step, every flicker of expression. She had seen too many cases in her life to trust the obvious explanation, and she felt certain that Harold's death had been neither accident nor the rash act of a boy. The key remained central in her mind, a link to something hidden, something that someone powerful in the village wished to remain secret. The twist arrived on a foggy Thursday morning. A scream rang from the parish hall, startling early risers and drawing them from their cottages. Mrs. Knight, pale and breathless, appeared first at the churchyard gate. "It's Mr. Marchmont," she cried. He's fallen, just like poor Harold." A crowd gathered quickly, murmuring fears and conjecture. Inspector Graves was summoned without delay, though he arrived with a measured calm, determined not to allow hysteria to overtake reason. By the time he reached the parish hall, the sexton was lying on the floor, groaning with pain. A ladder toppled beside him. Slipped while cleaning the vestry, Graves announced to the crowd, examining the old man's head, which bore no visible wound. No foul play, nothing more than a misfortune. Miss Marple, observing from the rear, remained unconvinced. She noted the angle of the ladder, the way one rung was slightly splintered, as though it had been weakened deliberately. She considered the sexton's past knowledge of the clock tower and the hidden spaces within. Marchmont had been invaluable to Harold, guiding him around the tower and revealing the odd corners where secrets could be hidden. Now he had fallen, or been made to fall, just as Harold had died. Accidents, she murmured under her breath, are often very deliberate. By noon the village was alive with speculation, more intense and feverish than ever. Those who had championed Peter Morton as the culprit were forced to reconsider, though many quietly held on to their suspicion, unwilling to shift blame from convenient targets. Miss Carter, for instance, found herself unusually pale when someone mentioned the coincidence of two incidents, and she hurried away from the conversation under the pretense of tending to her garden. George Taverner, who had once bristled with authority, now avoided the green entirely, claiming business in the city. Even Reverend Weatherby appeared more subdued than usual, lingering in the vestry while offering only perfunctory words to villagers. Miss Marple, meanwhile, made her own inquiries. She visited the parish hall under the guise of checking the schedule for the harvest fair, quietly asking about the ladder, the vestry and the old iron plate in the bell chamber. Each answer, each evasion, each nervous glance added threads to the pattern she was forming. She learned that the splintered rung had been noticed only after Marchmont's fall, that the old locks in the tower had long been the subject of hushed curiosity, and that someone who knew the tower intimately, had returned recently, leaving the key's purpose unknown to all but a select few. That evening in her sitting room, Miss Marple considered the implications. Two incidents in quick succession, both involving the tower and those who had access to its secrets, suggested more than coincidence. Someone was taking careful measures to ensure that the truth hidden in the stone chambers would remain concealed. Harold had died clutching a key, and now Marchmont had been incapacitated before he could guide anyone further. It was a pattern deliberate in its design, chilling in its clarity. The villagers, meanwhile, speculated wildly. Mrs. Knight feared the worst, imagining a secret society or smuggling ring. Mrs. Carter whispered darkly about hidden letters and blackmail. The younger generation, curious and impressionable, added ghost stories and imagined curses to the mix. The story of the clock tower had become a living thing, evolving and twisting with every retelling, and yet the heart of it, the metallic key, the hidden chamber, the murdered caretaker remained unseen. Miss Marple's calm was the only constant. She noted each person's reaction to Marchmont's fall, who approached with concern, who hung back with hesitation, and who seemed subtly relieved that the incident might redirect suspicion from themselves. It was a delicate human calculus, and she had long been skilled at reading it. By the time she went to bed, the night was heavy with fog, and the tower loomed darkly over the village. Its silence seemed more ominous than ever, a sentinel guarding truths that the living feared to uncover. Miss Marple, sitting by the lamp, knitting quietly, considered her next steps. She needed to see the tower again, to inspect the hidden spaces herself, to observe the reactions of those around her. The key would unlock more than a door. It would unlock the hearts of the villagers, revealing motives, fears, and guilty knowledge. And in that silence, she realized that the murderer was becoming more cautious. Every action, every glance, every effort to conceal past misdeeds was now measured, deliberate, calculated. The net was tightening, and Miss Marple, patient and observant, knew that the next misstep would reveal everything. The following morning brought a crisp clarity to St. Aldhelm's, the sunlight glinting on dew-laden rooftops and illuminating the green where villagers went about their routines with a careful eye toward appearances. Miss Marple, however, had little interest in appearances today. Her focus was entirely on behavior, nuance, and the subtle slips that revealed more than words ever could. She began her day with a quiet visit to the churchyard, ostensibly to water her small cluster of chrysanthemums, but in reality to watch the villagers. Mrs. Carter arrived soon after, ostensibly to prune her roses, but her glances toward the clock tower betrayed a nervous awareness. Miss Marple, murmuring a comment about the brightness of the blooms, watched her fingers fidget with the pruning shears. A slip of the hand, a pause too long over a petal, spoke volume. Next came George Taverner, carrying bundles of letters and appearing to hurry about his business, but pausing repeatedly as if measuring the reactions of those around him. He nodded curtly to Miss Marple, who replied with a soft smile, allowing her attention to drift elsewhere. In the course of a few minutes she noted a faint tremor in his fingers, the brief avoidance of her eyes, and the overly casual way he brushed past the gatepost, as though hiding a memory or action he feared she might notice. Even the vicar, Reverend Weatherby, who always maintained a composed exterior, revealed himself in small ways, a sigh when he thought no one observed, a glance to the clock tower that lingered too long, and a slight stiffening of posture when Miss Marple approached with her basket. All indicated unease. The vicar was a man accustomed to trust and discretion, yet he carried a worry he could not entirely mask. Miss Marple's next step required subtlety. She arranged, with a pretense of casual conversation, for a few of the villagers to be near the green at staggered intervals, remarking aloud on minor details she noticed in the tower, the bell chamber, and the hidden iron plate. Each remark was carefully calculated to provoke a reaction without arousing suspicion. Mrs. Carter paused mid-prune. Taverner's hand twitched. Reverend Weatherby's lips pressed together, his eyes flicking to a window high in the tower. Each minor gesture was a thread, and Miss Marple began to weave the tapestry of human guilt before her. Later, in the tea shop, she employed another tactic. She engaged Mrs. Knight and Mrs. Barnes in discussion about the inquest, allowing references to Peter Morton to surface. When the conversation returned to the key, she casually mentioned a story of hidden compartments in other churches, ones that concealed documents and valuables. A man might discover such a thing without intending to, only to find himself in danger, she added softly. Mrs. Knight shivered. It's terrible to think someone could be harmed for curiosity, she murmured. Indeed, Miss Marple replied, eyes on her cup. Sometimes curiosity uncovers truths that others would rather remain hidden. And when secrets are threatened, people can act unexpectedly. The reactions were illuminating. Mrs. Knight looked uneasy, glancing at the window as though imagining someone listening. Mrs. Barnes pursed her lips and nodded in quiet apprehension. Both were polite, cautious, and careful, yet the subtle ripple of fear betrayed that they knew more than they admitted. Miss Marple's observations continued into the afternoon, when she visited Marchmont at his home. The sexton's fall had left him bruised and wary, but his mind remained keen. Over a pot of tea, she gently probed the details of his accident. I noticed the rung of the ladder, Miss Marchmont, she said. It seemed unusually splintered, did it not? Marchmont looked uneasy, then quickly nodded. Aye, Miss Marple. I thought it strange myself, but who would tamper with an old ladder? No one could gain from it, I thought. Perhaps more than one person might gain, she suggested lightly, if they wish to keep certain matters hidden. Do you recall anyone near the tower recently? Someone perhaps unusually interested in the bell chamber or old locks? The sexton hesitated, eyes lowering to the floor. I saw Mrs. Carter there last week, coming and going at odd hours. She claimed she was checking for repairs, but I do not trust that explanation. And George Taverner has been seen lingering near the gates, always peering up at the tower as if he hoped no one noticed. Miss Marple inclined her head. You see, Mr. Marchmont, there are always those who think no one observes, and yet every action leaves a trace. By evening, she had compiled a clearer picture of the village's hidden dynamics. Peter Morton, the boy so eagerly blamed, was impulsive but transparent, incapable of the calculated silence that the real culprit required. The adults, Taverner, Miss Carter, Reverend Weatherby, carried fears, hesitations, and small acts of concealment, and all converged on the clock tower, the iron plate, and the key Harold had died clutching. Miss Marple sat by her lamp that night, her knitting needles clicking with a quiet determination. The psychological test had yielded results. The guilty party was careful, calculating, and above all, accustomed to hiding misdeeds under a veneer of respectability. The clues were not in the physical evidence, but in the small human gestures, the fleeting glances, and the subtle tension that ordinary conversation could not entirely disguise. She allowed herself a faint smile. The stage was nearly set. The next step would require patience, a carefully placed word, a seemingly innocent question, and the observation of a reaction. Soon the veil would lift, and the truth behind Harold Pritchard's death, Marchmont's fall, and the key in the clock tower would emerge. Outside, the fog drifted past the dark silhouette of the tower, curling around the edges of the village like a secret waiting to be uncovered. Inside, Miss Marple's mind worked quietly and relentlessly, following the hidden threads where others only saw ordinary life. The morning dawned, pale and misty, with the kind of soft light that blurred the edges of the village and made even familiar landmarks seem uncertain. Miss Marple, as always, rose early, her knitting basket at her side, and her mind already turning over the events of the past week. Today she intended to observe more closely than ever, and to test the nerves of the person she suspected most. Her opportunity arrived at the parish hall, where a meeting had been arranged ostensibly to plan the harvest fair. Villagers filtered in, chattering and arranging chairs, yet Miss Marple's attention was focused on George Taverner, who arrived later than most, brisk and purposeful, though a subtle tension clung to his movements. She greeted him with her usual polite smile, noting the way he hesitated before replying, his eyes flicking repeatedly to the clock tower outside the window. As the meeting commenced, she asked innocuous questions, touching lightly on past events and the care of the tower, while sprinkling in casual remarks about the key Harold Pritchard had been found holding. "I do wonder," she said softly, "what Harold might have discovered in that old iron plate. Such curiosities, hidden for decades, can sometimes reveal matters far beyond anyone's expectations." Taverner's hand twitched as he reached for a paper, his knuckles whitening. He coughed, clearing his throat in a way that drew a few curious glances. Miss Marple, pretending not to notice, continued her gentle probing. "And yet," she added, "so many of us move through the village without noticing small details. A ladder slightly splintered, a door slightly ajar, a key lost or found. Each could be trivial, or each could be so important that lives are changed." Taverner's eyes flicked toward her, a momentary shadow of recognition passing across his face before he quickly masked it with a practiced composure. Miss Marple's smile remained serene. She had seen the exact moment when a guilty conscience betrays itself, and she was patient enough to let it reveal more. Later, she requested to see Taverner in the tower itself, ostensibly to measure the space for fair decorations. As they ascended the winding staircase, she kept the conversation casual, discussing repairs, minor village matters, and local gossip. Yet, every remark about the old iron plate, about hidden compartments, and about Harold's key was deliberate. At the bell chamber, she paused and let her gaze linger on the splintered rung of the ladder and the shadowed crevice where the plate rested. "It must be fascinating," she murmured, "to consider what secrets might lie hidden in these walls. One wonders who has taken care to ensure certain things remain undiscovered." Taverner stiffened, his hand brushing the rail nervously. He cleared his throat again, his usual confidence faltering in the subtle pressure of observation. Miss Marple's voice was soft, almost idle, yet each word carried intent. "People often assume that what they conceal is forgotten, but sometimes they overestimate how well others can be deceived." For a long moment, Taverner said nothing, and the silence between them became almost tangible, the faint tick of the distant tower clock marking the tension. Then, unconsciously, he shifted his gaze to the iron plate and recoiled slightly, a brief yet unmistakable indication that he knew more than he wished to admit. Miss Marple allowed a quiet smile to cross her lips. The reaction was subtle, but it confirmed her suspicions. The person who had acted to silence Harold, and who had attempted to control what Marchmont knew, had revealed themselves through that minor, instinctive movement. She said nothing more at the time, guiding him gently back down the staircase, each step measured and calm, the atmosphere carefully controlled so that he would not suspect her awareness. After the meeting, as the villagers dispersed, she returned home and reviewed her observations. The nervous twitch, the involuntary recoil, the calculated avoidance of certain topics, all pointed unmistakably to Taverner. He had been the careful, calculating hand behind Harold's death, fearful that the key and the secrets it unlocked would expose a past indiscretion or scandal. Miss Marple considered the pattern of events once more. Harold's meticulous observations, Marchmont's sudden fall, the freshly scuffed ladder, the hidden iron plate, and the key. Each incident was a piece of a larger puzzle, now falling into place. The timing, the subtle manipulations, and Taverner's reactions made the picture clear in her mind. She allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. The next step would require delicacy and patience. Taverner would be led to believe that he remained in control, that his secrets were safe, and that the key would reveal nothing. But with careful words and the right provocation, he would betray himself further, until the full truth of Harold Pritchard's death and the hidden chamber in the Clocktower could be revealed to the entire village. And so, Miss Marple prepared for the final stage. She would need to orchestrate the reveal with the precision of a playwright, timing her questions and observations to ensure that the guilty party could not escape exposure. Outside, the tower stood silent and foreboding, a guardian of secrets that would soon be laid bare, and inside her quiet home, Miss Marple's mind worked steadily, knitting together the threads of human behavior into a tapestry of undeniable truth. The village gathered on the green once more, summoned by Miss Marple under the pretense of a community meeting to discuss the upcoming harvest fair. There was a murmur of curiosity, even apprehension. Some feared gossip, some feared recrimination, and others simply wondered what the serene old lady had in mind. Yet none suspected that the final truth, long hidden behind layers of human deceit, was about to be revealed. Miss Marple greeted the villagers warmly, her knitting basket at her side, her voice soft yet carrying the authority of one who has observed far more than anyone imagined. "I thought it fitting," she began, "that we should all gather here today in the presence of one another to consider what has transpired over these past weeks." Her eyes swept the crowd, lingering ever so slightly on George Taverner, who shifted uneasily under her gaze. "Harold Pritchard's death," she continued, "and the unfortunate accident involving Mr. Marchmont have troubled this village. Many have speculated, many have assigned blame, and many have acted from fear or assumption. But the truth, as it often is, lies in the smallest details, details that, if observed carefully, can reveal more than words ever could." The villagers murmured uneasily, glancing at one another, while Miss Marple held up the tarnished key. "This key," she said gently, "was found in Harold's hand. At first it seemed a minor object of little importance, yet it led me to consider what Harold had discovered, and why someone might wish to silence him." Taverner's face paled slightly, though he attempted to maintain his composure. Miss Marple continued, her tone soft but precise. "Harold was a careful man. He noticed things others overlooked. A splintered rung on a ladder, an unusual visit to the Clocktower, a hidden iron plate concealing a secret compartment. It was there that he found what was meant to remain unseen." She gestured to the tower itself, standing silent and foreboding above the green. "And it is there, in the shadows, that the truth was threatened and lives endangered. The person responsible believed their secrets could remain buried and acted to ensure Harold's silence. Taverner, you were aware of what Harold had discovered, and your efforts to control that knowledge ultimately led to both his death and Mr. Marchmont's accident." A collective gasp swept through the crowd. Taverner's lips pressed together, his hands fidgeting, and for the first time his composed facade cracked. "Miss Marple," he stammered. "I? It was not me." Miss Marple held up a hand, allowing the silence to settle over him like a weight. "You underestimated the power of observation. While you were careful, you were not infallible. Small gestures, fleeting expressions, the avoidance of certain topics, all of these betrayed you. And when one is observed patiently, as I have observed you, even the most meticulous deception will unravel." She turned to the villagers, her expression gentle. The key unlocked more than a door. It unlocked the truth. The iron plate concealed documents and evidence of past misdeeds that Mr. Taverner feared would come to light. He acted to prevent exposure, and in doing so, caused tragic consequences. And Sir Taverner, realizing the inevitability of exposure, slumped slightly. "Yes, it was me," he admitted finally, voice low and resigned. "I feared the past being revealed. Harold discovered something I had hoped remained forgotten. I never intended him to die, only to prevent the knowledge from spreading. I did not foresee, not Marchmont." Miss Marple nodded solemnly. "Intent and outcome often differ, Mr. Taverner, yet the lesson remains. Human behavior leaves traces. What is concealed in shadow will, in time, be revealed to those who watch closely enough." Inspector Graves stepped forward, handcuffs ready, while the villagers watched in a mixture of relief and horror. The simplicity of the final solution contrasted sharply with the complexity of the events leading to it. Peter Morton's name was finally cleared entirely, and whispers of misplaced suspicion faded into gratitude for the old lady who had quietly pieced together the truth. Miss Marple lingered near the clock tower later that afternoon, gazing at the sunlit stone and reflecting on the human heart. Secrets, she thought, are a fragile thing. Respectability, the desire to maintain appearances, and the fear of exposure, these are forces that can drive even ordinary people to extraordinary acts. And yet, even in a village like St. Aldhelm's, patience, observation, and a careful eye could restore justice and reveal what was hidden. The village gradually returned to its routines, though with a touch more caution in conversations and glances. Mrs. Carter tended her garden with renewed diligence, but without her previous airs of secrecy. Reverend Weatherby resumed his sermons, emphasizing honesty and vigilance in gentle moral reminders, and the clock tower, silent sentinel over the green, seemed a little less ominous now, having surrendered its secret under the calm, perceptive gaze of Miss Marple. Sitting once more in her quiet home, knitting by the lamp, Miss Marple allowed herself a faint smile. Another mystery resolved, another glimpse into the human heart laid bare. The key, the clock tower, and the careful observation of behavior had revealed the truth, as it always did. And though the village would resume its ordinary routines, she knew that beneath the surface, the lessons of curiosity, discretion, and human frailty would linger, quietly shaping lives long after the mystery had ended.